welcome once again Jean Kirkpatrick, Professor of the Practice of International Affairs and Director of Geopolitics of Energy Project at the John F. Kennedy School of Government, Megan O'Sullivan.
Good afternoon, and if I could ask you to please take your seats for our last panel of what has been a very interesting day. And this panel, we reserved time to speak about Iran. And we've talked a lot about geopolitical risk, and there's probably no other single country so consistently associated with geopolitical risk and impact on energy markets than Iran. We all can remember back, I think most of us can remember back to 1979 and the Iranian Revolution and the impact that that had on oil markets. And we fast forward to the last 10 or 15 years when Iran would talk about the potential of closing the Straits of Hormuz and how that had a major impact on markets. And even just a few years ago, we were talking about the possibility of the use of military force against Iran and what that could do to energy markets. And of course, today and this week, this month is a very interesting and exciting time to be talking about Iran with the new domestic developments there. So we have a great panel to discuss these and other developments. I think you know them all, but I'll just mention them briefly, starting immediately on my left. We have Carlos Pascual, ambassador, former U.S. ambassador to Mexico and Ukraine, and now a senior vice president at IHS and a former U.S. energy coordinator. We have General Jim Jones, who's been introduced to you earlier. You know he's the interim chairman of the Atlantic Council. Ambassador Zal Khalilzad, who was U.S. ambassador to Iraq, Afghanistan, and the United Nations, and now the president of Khalilzad Associates. And lastly, Amos Hochstein, who is currently the senior vice president of Tellurian and also formerly a U.S. energy coordinator. So we have a great group to discuss these issues. Admittedly, we're a little U.S. focused, but I think these four gentlemen certainly bring a broader perspective, and I'll look to people in the audience to help supplement some of the ideas up here with regional perspectives. So I'd like to start by talking maybe about just what we've seen happen in the last few weeks unfolding in Iran in the domestic arena and these protests. And earlier we heard from one of our conference participants that this was maybe smaller than the 2009 protests, but maybe more significant. And Zal, could I start with you and ask you if you could say a few words about the protests, how significant you think they are, and what they might mean for long-term Iranian politics?
Well, thank you very much, Megan. It's a pleasure to be here first. Second, I'd like to make a broad point that for the past several years, the struggle against ISIS and Daesh and the future of Syria and Iraq were front and center in terms of world attention with regard to this region and even US policy. But in more recent times, it is really the internal developments and changes in policies of the three major players with regard to this region that have become more front and center. And I mean the reform movement launched in Saudi Arabia, questions about its prospects, how important it will be if it succeeds, questions about the adjustments that are being made in Turkish policy, an important ally of the United States and its relations with us. And then more recently, Iran, a very unexpected series of demonstrations that have the world attention for the past several days and weeks focused on. I believe that this movement that we have seen is important, is quite important, and has the potential to become even more important and perhaps transformative with regard to Iran. What has happened? One, that you see a movement that is different, if you like, from 2009. 2009 was one that was focused between the different factions inside the regime. The Green Movement was from the establishment, a struggle within the establishment, if you like, reformist and non-reformist, so-called. This movement, in my view, goes beyond the regime. It questions the legitimacy, the performance, the efficacy, the delivery by this regime as a whole, both reform and so-called hardline elements. So that's very important. Two, it is much more widespread in terms of its geography compared to the 2009 one, which was more Persian-speaking, Tehran-centered movement. This one is more, much broader, actually more concentrated in smaller towns and cities, but all across Iran. Third, it's also more lower middle class and workers and poorer part of the Iranian population. And what their demands have been much bigger than the demands of the 2009 movement. As to why this has happened, I would just summarize by saying it has to do with the mismanagement of the economy by the government. Prices have gone way up. People saving in the millions have been put at risk and have been lost because of fraudulent financial institutions. Budgetary priorities have been questioned broadly in terms of the removal of some subsidies, which is, people are talking about the price of eggs that has gone so much up, and yet the Revolutionary Guard's establishment has done well for itself. And that there is also disappointment. There was a high expectation, perhaps encouraged by the government when it was seeking a nuclear agreement with the United States, that the removal of sanctions would result in the improved standards of living for the Iranian people. Some people have done well, those who connected with contracts, but the population as a whole has been disappointed. I think that, this broad movement that questions the legitimacy of the regime, including its external policies, where the perception is perhaps exaggerated, how much it has cost Iran to do what it has done in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, and where else, that there is a push that the regime should be more focused on dealing with the problems of the people of Iran. As to the implications, just to finish on that, I see 2 or 3 scenarios. I don't think it's going to go away, this discontent in the immediate future, although the regime is quite well organized to suppress and control with the instruments that is available to it, and it has been attentive to having that capability. And it has been shown repeatedly a willingness to use whatever force is necessary to control the situation. But I think there are 3 quickly scenarios that I see. One is that this anti-regime movement can bring the reform so-called faction and the hardline faction together, that either they will kind of sing together or swim together and carry out reform, deal with the economic mismanagement and problems and priorities, and retrench, if you like. I think that while that's a possibility, I don't see that as likely. Second possibility is that they come together but don't reform. And third is that this pressure from outside increases tensions within the regime, and although they may control the current situation for a while, that it would lead to more instability and conflict. And depending on which scenario becomes dominant, and there are various factors that will affect which way things go, it could have huge implications for Iran and the region. On oil, I'd say one word, since this is an energy conference, is that historically, in changes and big changes in Iran, the oil sector has played an important role, particularly the workers.
Right.
And part of the discontent that's very specific, I talked about the general discontent, but there are specific discontents. The Kurds are unhappy because when an earthquake took place, the government didn't address it, the earthquake, in an efficient way. And people of Khuzestan have their own discontent, very specific. If the workers, if a scenario which increases or continues instability that ultimately brings in the workers, it could affect the energy policy, production, and the Iranian role, at least for as long as that continues. So far, that hasn't happened. Right. There have been attempts, but it has not happened. But of course, even the instability itself has affected, among other factors, the price, which has moved upward. So. Sure. Very important, potentially, one of a set of things that are happening in the region that deserves attention because it poses risks and opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you, Zal. And what's interesting about your three scenarios, they all involve change. There isn't really a status quo scenario that you gave us, so that you think there will continue to be political repercussions inside of Iran. We don't know exactly how they'll play out. But let me pick up where you left off on the energy point and turn to another one of our panelists. But again, everybody should feel free to jump in. Don't wait for me to invite you to. But Carlos, on this question of energy. So as Al mentioned, there were lots of unfulfilled economic expectations that fueled the protests. You know, how much of this should the Iranian leadership lay at the door of low oil prices? Is it low oil prices that made it difficult for the regime to deliver the kind of economic benefits that people had anticipated? And looking forward, what do you think the prospects are for the Iranian energy industry? What's the investment outlook for Iran in this current energy climate?
Megan, thank you, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for bringing us together and letting us have this conversation. Not very much of this could be blamed on low energy prices. Let's remember the implementation day of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action began in January of 2016, and the price of oil was around the mid-30s. So here we are 2 years later, the price of oil is touching on 70. In 2016, Iran was exporting about 1.1 million barrels a day as a result of constraints that were imposed by sanctions. They're exporting significantly over 2. So take whatever averages you might want over that period of time, but in 2017, Iran made, let's say, $7 to $10 billion more as a result of increasing exports and higher prices than it would have made otherwise. It's hard to say that that was the critical factor that was leading to these protests. I think we have to go back to a point that Zal was saying of people's disillusionment, that one of the things that was phenomenally powerful in this whole process was transparency. The transparency of the budget when it was published and people had an opportunity to see the differences between what they were experiencing for their own livelihoods, the impacts of certain types of structural reforms internally and the impact that that had on austerity, and what was being spent externally as a result of the IRGC. All right, so let's go to the question of what happens in the future and future investment. My guess is that General Jones or Amos will speak more to this and on the issue of decertification and sanctions, but let me just make two very simple points. There's a complex web of issues for those who don't follow the details of this, but for the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, for it to remain in force, it's not dependent on this issue of certification. It's dependent on the Trump administration renewing waivers of the National Defense Authorization Act and executive orders that began under the Obama administration. All right? And that choice is going to come up in a couple of days of whether or not they continue.
I think it's today, so it should be in a matter of hours.
Okay. Well,
yes,
we'll know in a matter of hours. Okay, so we can take bets on what's going to happen. I'll lay my bet that they'll actually go ahead and extend the waivers into the future. The other issue is one of certification. The certification is under the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act. And that began in 2015, and every 90 days the administration has to certify whether or not Iran is in compliance. And part of compliance has nothing to do with the technical compliance in the agreement, but it can have something to do with whether it's deemed to be in the national security of the interest of the United States, or whether we deem, the United States deems, that the benefits that Iran is giving is receiving as a result of this are consistent with its behavior. And that's where the decertification came. By the way, the International Atomic Energy Agency recertified Iran's compliance again in November of last year. So in terms of a technical support for undertaking this, the IAEA has continued to advance that. The critical thing here with certification is that when the administration decertifies it, and again, remember, this can happen every 90 days, the agreement is kicked back to the Congress. And the Congress has a 60-day period where they can snap back the old sanctions with a vote of just a simple majority. They don't need to actually have 60 votes to break a filibuster. Those sets of questions have created this huge uncertainty of what's the United States going to do, in addition to all of the overhanging banking issues that remained ahead of time, that if you touch the US banking system with any kind of transaction, then you potentially can be sanctioned. And it's those questions which are fundamentally affecting the desire of companies to go forward and really see an expansion of their investments. It'll be interesting to see, I think is a huge test case, Total. You know, they announced about a year ago, a little over a year ago at ADIPEC, major investments that they were going to make in Iran. We'll see how much willingness and capacity they have to be able to take that forward.
Great, thank you. And you've touched on many issues that we'll come back to, but let me stay on the energy investment question for a bit. Amos, do you have anything to add to that about how desirable does Iran look as a destination for energy investments now? And compared to what, right? This is not an opportunity-scarce market, but it's more of a capital-constrained market.
So I think as companies look at investments in general, they look, especially in the price environment that we have lived in over the last few years of low oil prices. Yes, we're back up to touching $70, but that's fairly recent. We've been at a relatively low price for quite some time. So as you make, and CapEx, during that period of time, companies' CapEx, their capital expenditures has shrunk around the world. So this industry has shrunk its investments around the world. So now, as we remove the sanctions, which again doesn't remove sanctions from the US, this is just from non-US companies to make investments, no secondary sanctions, you now have to make a decision. Do I want to go into Iran, or do I want to make an investment at all in upstream? If I do, is Iran the best place for me to make a decision? And this before I touch the geopolitics. This is just straight up, should I make a capital expenditure in oil and gas right now? And most companies were saying no around the world. Many companies were saying, if I'm going to go to the cheapest, most secure area. And that's where the question, the geopolitical question comes in of, why should I do this in Iran in light of everything that Carlos just said? I still have an uncertainty of a president of the United States and a Congress that keeps talking about snapback sanctions. We can have intellectual debates and we can say, it's not likely to happen, it's not going to happen, but that doesn't matter. If I go to my board and I present an investment, I don't think it's going to happen is not going to help. It's, I have a risk. And therefore, that risk ratio coming into the formula of making decisions is what's hurting the Iranians. So you have bad insurance rates, because most insurance companies don't want to insure going into investment in Iran. I have a bad political climate. I have a potential of snapback sanctions. I have a history of corruption. And I never know what the politics are going to be. So now, if I'm at $100 oil, those decisions are a little bit easier to make because my risk-reward is different. As long as we are still muddling in these prices, I think most companies are still making their decisions known, except with the exception of Total that Carlos mentioned. We have not seen a rush into the Iranian oil and gas market that people had predicted or feared post the Iran agreement.
So in some ways, this energy climate is affecting the ability of the Iranian government to rejuvenate its economy. I mean, there are other factors at work. Carlos mentioned some of them, and I'd like to get to one of them, and that is regional politics. As Carlos mentioned, it was the publication of the budget, and a lot of Iranians looking at it and seeing how much money was actually spent on regional forays that upset so many Iranians who were experiencing pullback of subsidies and other things. So General Jones, could I turn to you and just ask you to say a little bit about how you see the regional politics? On the one hand, in the last year or so, we've seen the situation politically and security-wise seem to worsen. The tensions in the region seem to be flaring up. But on the other hand, on the economic side, we've seen this cooperation with OPEC and non-OPEC members, leading us to think that maybe there's some more economic cooperation. What is the balance? And you, given your security background, and as you noted in the opening session today, that your focus is on peace and security, when you look at the regional politics, what's your assessment and Iran's role in it?
Well, thank you very much. I'm honored to be a part of this panel. I've known these gentlemen a long time and admired their work very much. You can put me in the group that says I refuse to recognize that Iran is a contributing member of the family of nations. I don't think they're deserving of that kind of status. I think there's a very disturbing element of appeasement, particularly in Europe and also in other countries, about Iran, as though, well, if we just treat them nicely, then maybe they'll change. If we invest in them, maybe they'll change their behavior. And that's not happening. I mean, Iran is still a country that sponsors non-state actors and terrorist activities. They are brutalizing their own people. I think one of the differences between the disturbances that are going on, the uprisings that are going on, is that this is more of a rural uprising, not an urban or a middle-class uprising. I think that's very different and probably more long-lasting because they're suffering. And I think the strategy of appeasement is not a good thing. I think we should be very firm on Iran. I completely agree with those people, and particularly in this region, who see Iran as an existential threat. And that's a powerful word in my life's experience. An existential threat means that you are afraid for your existence. And I hear that repeatedly in the region here, and I also agree with that. So while we did achieve a nuclear deal, and it has been technically upheld by the IAEA, you know, I think the overall behavior of Iran should not be judged by whether they are keeping up with their nuclear agreement. I don't trust Iran. I mean, I don't trust their government, and I don't trust their long-term their long-term goals, which I think are as clear as they were 10 or 15 years ago. In this region, there are geostrategic issues that are long-term, starting with the Middle East peace process, all the way to Iran's naked ambition of being able to build a highway, so to speak, between Tehran and Lebanon. And the only thing that's going to stop them from doing that is, frankly, U.S. presence in northern Iraq. And if we somehow vacate that territory, you have a strategic situation that could be catastrophic. The relations with Turkey are not particularly great right now. That plays into it. The Saudi Arabian relations with Turkey. But I have advocated that when you use the term existential threat regarding Iran, that the GCC countries and others should really think about forming a meaningful security relationship amongst themselves. somewhat a NATO-like organization with common tactics, techniques, procedures, common intelligence sharing, common missile defense architectures, and so on. I think that, first of all, that would be a very powerful message that Iran's future behavior along the lines that they're currently demonstrating in Yemen, in Lebanon, support to Hezbollah and Hamas, and the outcome of the conflicts that are, that are progressing in the region is extremely important. So I think that there's a legitimate concern about Iran becoming a nuclear power because of its ability to export that kind of technology to a non-state actor. And as we all know, if that happens, the world that we know, the world as we know it, is going to be much more difficult to live in.
So let me just ask for a clarification. When you say existential threat, you're looking at it from the perspective of the GCC countries, perhaps. What about from an American perspective? Do you see Iran as an existential threat in that capacity?
I do, in terms of its historical, but also continuing efforts to essentially destabilize countries and regions. And Iran has been a consistent thorn in our national policies. If they become a nuclear power in the sense that they were headed towards becoming, I think they do become a threat to the United States. But I think the interests of the United States are intrinsically tied to this region. I don't think. I think that one of the things the Trump administration has been correct in is reestablishing the relationships with our friends and allies in the region. And I think the strike on the Syrian air base early on demonstrated that the United States was back into a security partnership with the region that is extremely important.
Great, thank you. Zal, would you like to chime in here as well?
I think that in recent years, Iran has been pursuing hegemonic policy in this region to dominate this region. And it has made significant progress, it has. And it has been a continuation of the policy from the revolution to export the revolution. Now, the interest of the region and our own interest is, of course, for that effort of regional domination to succeed. And if Iran stops being a revolution, as Henry Kissinger has said, and act more like a nation state, there's no reason why one could not have some normal relationships. And one possibility as a result of the difficulties that we see now in Iran, and should they continue and reform doesn't take place, that over time, that this could lead to either by the evolution of the current system or by a different system, should it be replaced, that Iran becomes a normal player, if you like. And to achieve that goal, in my view, a balance of power approach with the kind of ideas that Jim has been talking about, where the smaller, weaker states can come together with allies from abroad to defend themselves, may be a necessary element besides change in the policies of Iran. And I think one of the potential in the debate that is occurring in the last few weeks and is likely to continue, I'm pessimistic or optimistic, depending on one's perspective, that the government would be able to control this, what is happening forever. So ultimately, frankly, the last point is this is the most unregulated region of the world compared to Europe, Asia. And eventually, the Gulf states, Iran, Turkey, there has to be some rules over which they have to agree. But in order to get to that, a balance of power and some of the steps that Jim has been talking about is necessary. And therefore, while there are risks associated with this, and one could see a scenario in which no reform, hardline domination, externalizing the problem, and becoming even more aggressive. But that, I think, if we can successfully contain and prevent that, I think it could lead to an internal evolution, which I think would be in everyone's interest.
And this might be an an optimistic view, but perhaps an external push, like the one that General Jones described, might be met with the internal push inside of Iran, where there might be some reluctance to continue the aggressive regional efforts in the face of a potential challenge internally. So maybe we could see these two things working together to change
Absolutely. Well, if
politics.
I might say a footnote to that, which is a very good point. I mean, we could learn from the Soviet experience. After all, as they were declining economically, they were aggressive externally, and we made that external aggressiveness very expensive for them. I mean, look at a place like Afghanistan. It became very expensive for them, and that led to a big change at home. And I think among the ideas that we're considering, besides what General Jones says about a kind of successful containment, if you like, by strong alliances, is also we have to look at how to increase the costs of aggressiveness abroad. And I don't think we have done that very well as so far.
General Jones, you wanted to hop in, and then Carlos.
One footnote. It's a worrisome one, but I think Zal would agree with this. The number of countries that are willing to speak out in defense of fundamental liberties seems to me to be shrinking. And that's really worrisome to me. If we're not willing to speak out, then it's really a good time to be a dictator. It's a good time. It's a good time to be Kim Jong-un. It's a good time to be, Vladimir Putin. It's a good time to be President Kabila in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, who refuses to step down. These are very worrisome trends for the fundamental values that we all hold dear. And I think that the international community really has to come to grips with this. But this policy of appeasement is at least vocal appeasement. I mean, forget the actual hardware that you might move around and the sanctions, but just not talking about it is really really worrisome. And you don't see in the EU, for example, you don't see any reaction from the EU or European countries, Western European countries, you should know better, to what's going on in Iran.
Mm-hmm. Carlos, you wanted to add?
I think it's important to think very strategically about questions of intervention and trying to understand where they can help and where they can hurt. One of the characteristics of the current movement within Iran, and Zal, I think you laid it out well, that it's widespread. It's based outside of the main cities. There's a lot of middle class and poor people that are involved. It's also leaderless.
Yeah.
Right? And as a result of being leaderless, there are many would-be leaders that want to take advantage of it, including Ahmadinejad, who has been appealing in a populist way to people, telling them that you have been exploited and I would be the person to lead you. And there are real dangers of external involvement and intervention in an environment like this, because it could produce results that, in fact, could be counter to our interest in the long term. And I think we should approach that with a degree of respect and concern. So one point for me on U.S. policy recommendations, if one is looking at American interventions internally with Iran to try to point this in a specific direction, there are real dangers in doing that, and it could lead in directions we don't want it to go. I think a second point, which is really critical, is that the concerns that you hear consistently in this region are a sense of concern about Iran encircling the region. And if you ask the question, is it a good thing or a bad thing for the breakout period for Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon to have increased from 2 months to a year, I don't think very many people would say that that was a bad thing. The question was whether or not the opportunity was taken in the course of those negotiations to be able to somehow constrain Iran's interventionism in the region. Right? And whether or not it would have been possible to do, or at that point in time, let's just put that aside, that's history. The question is, what do you do now? And in my mind, there is one critical thing which actually has to come to the top of the priority list. If I was in Riyadh and was thinking about missiles being fired at the capital, I would be concerned. And if I was a Saudi, I would be concerned. And if this region has been racked by conflict with ISIS in Syria, in Yemen, at times with Hezbollah, a confrontation between Sunnis and Iran would be overwhelmingly disastrous. We've seen it before. And so I think a critical question for the United States, maybe the GCC issue will come at some point in time, but there's an immediate question now of how can countries come together, the United States, Russia, the European countries, those who signed the Iran nuclear agreement, what role can they play to, in fact, actually bring under control the risk of further missiles being fired at Saudi Arabia? That has to be a critical starting point to take us off a path of greater escalation of tension and begin to reduce it again.
Thank you, Carlos. Let me use your comments to jump to the topic that we've all been touching on, which is the nuclear agreement and the future of it. And Amos, maybe I can go to you. You were working on this in the Obama administration. Could you give us your sense of what the future of this deal is? That is what so many people in this region and back at home are interested in knowing. As I mentioned, today is the day that President Trump decides whether or not new sanctions will be imposed or if a waiver will be once again extended. We know that he has met that requirement with a lot of reluctance, not interested in doing that, although his advisors seem to be suggesting otherwise. So is it realistic to think that this deal could be rolled back? Is there a better deal to be had, or do you have some other assessment?
Well, let's unpack that a little bit into pieces. First, the news, White House officials seem to be briefing the press that they have decided that the president will announce that he has extended the waiver yet again. I don't think too much of a surprise there. But I want to correct something that, or give nuance to something that you just said. Not issuing the waiver is not just bringing in new sanctions. It is the end of the Iran deal. So the decertification, as Carlos, I think, outlined really well, is just a
domestic affair.
Is a domestic political football of people who didn't like, Congress didn't like the deal, so they said, well, we're going to make you, President Obama, have to every 90 days sign a piece of paper that will embarrass you and cause you political harm. They now have to deal with that same consequence. So sometimes this is karma. But there is the end of the waiver is different. That's actually the end of the deal, because the U.S. part of the deal is the waiver of sanctions by executive order. And the other side, the Iranian side, then is essentially no longer committed to their part of the enrichment. So now let's look at the deal itself. We were facing a period of time where there was the threat of breakout, as Carlos just said, was within months. That was the Israeli assessment. It was most of the GCC assessment. It was European intelligence community assessment. It was the broad thinking and warning around the world, we are facing breakout, and therefore you have essentially two options. If our policy of longstanding position has been, we will not allow a nuclear Iran, you have two ways to do it once you reach breakout, and that is either through conflict or through reaching a deal. That was the environment in which the deal was reached. But now we have to think about where we are today. And where we are today, as we're being taken through public statements in the United States and around the world into extremes. And the one extreme is, this is the worst deal, we got to get out of it. Let's finish the waiver, reimpose the sanctions, and get out of the deal. And we'll deal with the consequences. That's one extreme. The other extreme has been, in briefings of those supportive of the deal, that no, this deal was not only good, it was perfect. there is no changes. Anybody suggesting a change or a lack of perfection in this deal is betraying the deal itself and the achievement that it won. And the problem is that if you watch cable news, if you read the newspapers, both in the United States but around the world, we have been put in this false dichotomy of choices that those are the two choices. And the reality is that the deal, whether you liked it or disagreed with it, it was a compromise, and therefore, by definition, it was not perfect. It led, whether you couldn't debate, and we can debate from now to the end of time, whether you could have, negotiators could have reached a better deal. I don't know, perhaps, but it's what we have. The consequences of eliminating the deal just by ending waivers and doing it unilaterally are catastrophic, because it puts Iran back into the nuclear weapons game without European support for our position, potentially without Russian support, without Chinese support, and therefore we will be less equipped in addressing that threat and be able to, and get perilously closer to the other solution, which was conflict. The flip side doesn't mean that we have to keep it as is. We do have options, and we can review deals. But the way to do that is not to put the gun on the table and say, I'm getting out. It's to say to our European allies that I think General Jones is right, have gone a little bit too far in their support for the post-deal era, and that to sit down and say, look, we have some weaknesses here. And if we work together, I fully intend on staying in the deal, but we need to see what we can do to maintain security for the GCC region, for Europe, for the United States, for a global community. That is where I think we have room. And the idea that's floating around that we can simply reimpose sanctions, and this goes back to the energy point, because I'm a firm believer, and Carlos and I worked for a while together on the implementation of the oil sanctions, and they worked far better than anybody expected. Both those who authored the congressional legislation, the administration, the Iranians themselves, and the rest of the world. We took the Iranians from 2.5 million barrels a day to 1, and from 23 customers to 5. But that is not possible to reimpose. The reason we were able to do that is because the EU passed not mirror, but similar sanctions. It was because other of the main consumers of oil around the world were willing to play ball because they believed that it was part of a construct towards a deal. And we were in negotiations. So the idea that we will simply, don't worry about it, we won't waive the sanctions, everything will come back into play, they'll reduce their exports immediately back down to 1 million barrels a day, and we'll be exactly where we were in 2015. To me, that's not reading the situation clearly.
Thank you. I'd like to see if we could get some perspectives from the region and from the audience now. Just because if the press briefing is accurate and in fact President Trump does reissue the waivers, it doesn't mean this issue has been resolved in the US body politic. This is going to come up again and again and again. And so I'll maybe turn back to the panel if they have other views on the deal. But let me take a moment to turn to our audience and see if anyone would like to make a comment or pose a question to the panel. Okay, Ambassador Mark Sievers, up here in the front, there's the U.S. Ambassador to Oman.
Yeah, I think General Jones sort of hit this point, and most of the rest of the discussion's been about the JCPOA. But I think leaving the nuclear deal aside, there are very, very fundamental issues of Iran's behavior in the region, Iran's involvement in undermining our friends and allies and posing direct threats to our forces. And, you know, just from some random conversations I've had with Iranian officials I've run into in Doha and other places, this sense that they seem to have before these latest disturbances, at least, that nobody can stop them. I mean, the people I talked to, a former ambassador, retired, and some academics basically said, you know, the United States can't touch us. You can't do anything to us. If you do, we will unleash missiles at all of your friends of the region. We will attack your forces in the region. You can't risk that, and therefore we are, able to do whatever we want. That has to be reversed. And maybe it'll happen through a process of internal change, but if it doesn't, I'm all for imposing as much cost on them as we possibly can. So that's my comment.
And again, that can be done outside touching.
Absolutely, outside of the nuclear agreement.
Exactly. Thank you, Mark. Any other comments? Yes, over on the side.
Hi, thank you very much. I'd like to firstly commend the balanced panel a little bit there. I had two questions. The first question was, and I was just sort of reading over the description, amid this escalation in tensions, what can be done to forge productive path forward, minimize geopolitical risks, and find common ground for conversation? I'd like to ask the panelists, why is the conversation more about what Iran should do and not what the rest of the region should also at the same time do to forge these relationships from both sides? And the second question is around investment. You mentioned an equation, let's say, about the reasons why some of the sort of IOCs are cautious about investing in Iran, whether the price isn't high enough, there's a high risk premium, the reward isn't high enough, corruption. I'd like to argue against those cases. I think credit should be given where it's due. I think the country has made a lot of headways in trying to encourage investors to come in. The oil prices have recovered modestly. The cost of the production is still quite low in Iran compared to the rest of the region. The corruption we see in Iran, speculative corruption, is comparable to many of the oil exporting countries in the world. So I'd like to sort of revisit this risk premium here and reassess it in the context of the global energy producers.
Great. Thank you for bringing another perspective. If anyone on the panel would like to comment, Zal and then Amos, about what others might do to bring about a more stable geopolitical environment in particular.
Well, first I want to say a word about the nuclear thing that was said by colleagues earlier. What I like about the Trump administration's approach on this issue has been that whatever you say about the agreement, the nuclear agreement, whether it could have been better, that we have more leverage and we appreciate it at the time. Putting that aside, I think this administration, unlike the previous one in my view, which thought this agreement was so important that it perhaps negatively affected its willingness for fear of risking reaching an agreement and keeping it to push back against the Iranian aggressive behavior. That this administration is signaling that well, this agreement is more in the interest of Iran than us, thus giving itself some room to maneuver to push back. And I think that is not so unsmart. That I think it actually may be smart to say that you want the agreement to continue. We think it's flawed, and I'm going to not only seek to improve it, but also push back. So, but second, on what could be done, what others could do, I think that the best way to help Iran move towards a more constructive relationship with the region is ideas such as what General Jones was saying, or increasing the cost of being aggressive, as it has been, the kind of messages that the ambassador was saying that Iranians were thinking that they're on a roll, nobody's going to be able to stop them. And this, I think, the increasing that cost of that sort of behavior.
Can you be more specific?
For example, well, I mean, I of course was very heavily involved in our effort to make things expensive for the Soviets when they went to various regions of the world. It is not that, frankly, that hard to make the cost of policies of Iran in Iraq, in Syria, and elsewhere, that if they want to be there and dominate it, Well, there are a lot of people in both countries that are opposed to that, would like to resist that. And if we embrace the objective that what's important is to increase the cost to the Iranians, there are things we could do, support.
Outside of sanctions, you're talking more broadly, outside of sanctions.
Outside of,
yeah.
In addition to sanctions.
In addition to sanctions, okay.
On the ground, making sure they suffer casualties, making sure they suffer more costs to achieve the objective that they have. And therefore, as in the case of the Soviet Union, this gap between the economy and the level of effort globally is what caused ultimately the collapse. I think is worthy of study, worthy of learning from. And I think sanctions are important, supporting allies are important, deterrence is important, but also imposing costs on the ground where they're seeking domination would be important. And one shouldn't allow the nuclear agreement, as one didn't allow a START agreement or détente ideas to stop us from imposing costs when our interests were being challenged, when the Soviet Union was being aggressive.
Yeah, we are at about the witching hour. I know Amos and Carlos and General Jones would like to make one last comment. If you could limit yourself to a minute, possibly, that would be great.
So one, nothing I said before about the Iran deal I should have maybe started with a premise. The premise is Iran is a terrorist supporting state. It is a bad actor. It does nothing positive in the region. But I take that when we start this conversation, we all take that for granted. Maybe I should have started with it. So nothing I said. The Iran deal was a very narrow negotiation. It was done so because the United States wanted it narrow. This region wanted to keep it narrow. And the Iranians ultimately wanted to keep it narrow. So it was narrow. It doesn't stop us, before the deal, during the negotiations, and now, from taking any of the actions, whether I may agree with some and disagree with others, that Zal is suggesting, or that General Jones is suggesting. We do have to keep the pressure up. It is in our interest to limit Iran's ability to do harmful and their policies that are essentially to promote their political agenda through terrorist and violent means. That is what we are objecting to. So where I disagree with Zal is that putting the gun on the table of saying, I'm going to withdraw, I hate this deal, it's a bad deal, puts a unilateral aspect into my action that my allies that I need in order to be able to achieve what you're saying, and that's what when you say about...
I don't favor withdrawal. I just said not to say it's so sacrosanct, I want to change, and I don't want that, the fact that I have this agreement to hold me back, and you and I now agree with, from doing the things that we need to do. The perception is, and I don't know whether you would agree with that the Obama administration self-restrained because of the perception that to be aggressively responding to Iranian expansionism could put the deal at risk during negotiations and afterwards. That's what my only comment.
First, we already achieved one thing here. Zal and I are now in agreement.
Right.
This is not a small thing for those of you who don't know. So I'm just going to need to...
But just to finish that point that what Zal was talking about, I don't think the Obama administration restrained itself because of the negotiations. There were a lot of factors that meant that we had to look in a restrained, act in a restrained manner. We do have a major US presence in this region that was at risk in Iraq. We have other interests that doing something that was aggressive during that time was weighed. You can argue whether they were right or wrong, but I don't think that we were putting the deal as sacrosanct and therefore don't take any other aggressive matters. So I think just completing this circle.
You reject the political report on...
completely.
Okay.
And I think it's offensive to think any president of the United States would do those kinds of things. But I think we can keep the deal intact, look to our allies, that's not intact, keep the deal and not threaten to leave it unilaterally, work with our allies to improve whatever we can, while maintaining and upgrading our pressure on the Iranians, on the Iranian regime throughout the region. And I think that's achievable.
Okay, thank you. Carlos, quickly, any last words?
I think we need to focus some attention on Yemen. It's a situation where...
Yemen, I don't know if everyone heard. Yeah.
Because it's become a proxy war. You have the surrounding states in the region spending billions of dollars a month. which is costing them dearly. American military participation has been a constant theme throughout that process. Iran has been involved, and one of the direct impacts has been missiles that have been fired on surrounding states. And that has to be resolved. And if this is an example of putting a cost on Iranian action, where you spend billions of dollars, American military intelligence, and the result is still a threat to the surrounding states, it's not a good solution. So I think there needs to be a policy focus on how to bring together interested parties, not just in the region, but externally, to be able to, first of all, get a ceasefire and stop the threat of missiles being fired in the region. This region has been under theological and philosophical tensions, not for decades, but for centuries. They're going to continue. But there are very concrete things that have to be addressed to make everybody more secure. And that's a critical point that has to be focused on as a starting point right now.
And not to mention the humanitarian crisis in Yemen as well, another reason for action. And General Jones, your final closing comments for the whole panel.
Thank you. Let me just very clearly say that I completely agree with Amos's characterization of the nuclear deal. We are where we are. Right. We know how we got there. It's a compromise. So I think that there are 5 things that we need to do to move forward and to try to keep the region, make the region safer and more at peace in the long term. The first one relates to the nuclear deal, but it relates to the behavior of Iran itself. That's a constant, vigorous, and skeptical eye on compliance. And that means making the IAEA do what it's supposed to do. It means close consultation with our allies, listening to our friends in the region, not jumping to conclusions from Washington alone, but really keeping a certitude in the Iranian capital that we are watching, and we're watching every single day. It's too important not to. Second, I think that we should remain focused on a just outcome in Syria. This is something that will be felt in Tehran. I alluded to this highway between Tehran and Lebanon, that if that became a reality, would be geostrategically the game changer. We shouldn't let that happen, but the outcome of Syria, I think, is very important. Third, I think we should support, to the best we can, any efforts that GCC countries make towards forming a more meaningful buffer against Iranian threats. It doesn't mean intervention, but it means protecting yourself where you can. Frankly, it's cheaper if you do it collectively than if you do it individually. And the United States, by virtue of its long NATO experience, knows exactly how to be a good ally to a strong alliance. And I think that would send a very powerful message. Fourth, and I've said this for many, many years, the Middle East peace process has to be reinvigorated, and we need to get parties to the table. And there's not enough time yet for me to go through that, but that's one of the things that I think is central to peace and stability. And fifth, I think we need more consistent and visible support to the Iranian people who hunger for a government worthy of their heritage and their aspirations. And there's many ways in which we can do that in the media, in think tanks. We should keep that shield up there so that they can feel it and see it. Ultimately, it's going to be the Iranian people who are going to decide what happens in Iran. It doesn't mean that you have to do a lot of nefarious things, but at least recognize when people are hurting and they feel they have no future, and their government is a government of oppression. So those are the 5 things that I would think would be important to do.
Great. Thank you for ending us on that very prescriptive note. Please join me in thanking our panel for discussing a very complicated and important topic. Thank you all.